The air on Zeltrax 9 had a smell that reminded Silas Marten of burnt citrus. He wasn't sure if that was the native atmosphere or just the cafeteria's attempt at Universal Cuisine Day. Either way, he was sneezing uncontrollably, and the aliens watching him from their clustered lunch tables were somewhere between horrified and fascinated. "Does your respiratory cavity malfunction often?" asked Krelix, a tall, pale blue being with 3 eyes stacked vertically on his forehead. He was perched on the edge of the bench like he was trying not to touch anything. Silas clutched a napkin to his nose, voice muffled. "No, it's not that. It's allergies." Krelix blinked his 3 eyes at different intervals. "Is this a self-inflicted condition?" "It's not on purpose," Silas said, blowing his nose again. "It's my immune system overreacting to stuff it sees as a threat, like pollen or dust." The cafeteria went quiet. Several species had paused mid-bite, their attention now fully on Silas. A small purple being named Gadu leaned forward from the next table. "Your body attacks air particles?" "Not all air particles," Silas said. "Just specific things. Like plant spores or fur, or, apparently, whatever's in that citrus-flavored protein slab you guys love." Gadu looked down at his lunch tray with newfound suspicion. "Is this fatal?" asked Krelix. "No, just annoying. I've had worse." Silas reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a small white pill. He popped it into his mouth and washed it down with a gulp of water. "What did you just do?" Krelix asked, leaning closer. "Took an antihistamine," Silas said. "It tells my body to calm down." Now the entire table was staring. Even the usually passive Zarnid twins had stopped clicking their eye stalks toward each other. Gadu stood up. "You took a pill, and it stopped your body from waging war on itself." Silas shrugged. "Yeah, should kick in within 20 minutes. Krelix looked at Silas like he had just performed surgery with a spoon. "But how does it know what to stop?" "It doesn't," Silas said. "It just dampens the whole immune response. Less swelling, less sneezing. Works great." Krelix looked at Gadu, then back at Silas. "Your medical system is chaotic." "Welcome to humanity," Silas muttered, tugging a tissue from the box he'd started keeping on hand. "We break, we patch ourselves up with duct tape and pills, and we keep going." After lunch, Silas headed toward the Habitat Studies wing, still sniffling. The alien students trailing behind him whispered in their native tongues, occasionally pointing at the tissue box he carried like it was a nuclear device. Professor Varn, a tall being with translucent skin and visible organs, was already setting up a simulation of multi-climate habitats when Silas entered. The room adjusted to simulate a mild earth spring. Almost immediately, Silas sneezed again. "Professor," he said between coughs, "can we dial down the simulated pollen?" Varn tilted his head. "But the simulation is based on your home planet. This is considered a comfortable atmosphere for humans." "Not for me," Silas said. "Spring is allergy season." Varn tapped a control panel. "Fascinating. You are reacting to your own planet's reproductive cycle." "Plants don't ask for consent," Silas said, sitting down and blowing his nose again. "They just launch spores and hope for the best." The other students seemed increasingly disturbed. A reptilian species called the Thessarians were now whispering and glancing at the air vents. "Should we evacuate?" Gadu asked. "If the room is filled with reproductive particles." "No one's getting pregnant," Silas snapped. "It's just pollen." That didn't ease anyone's nerves. By the time class ended, the antihistamine was starting to work. Silas's nose was less red, and his voice no longer sounded like it was being filtered through gravel. But now he was exhausted. The meds always made him drowsy. He trudged back to the dormitory, where his roommate, a bright orange quadruped named Jarn, was hanging from the ceiling hammock. "You were attacked by the air again," Jarn noted. "Yeah," Silas said, collapsing onto his bed. "But I took a pill. I told Zarnid you might be dying." "I'm not." "He said you looked like you were." "I always look like that when I have allergies." Jarn blinked slowly. "That is not reassuring." Silas stared at the ceiling, the weight of the day pressing down on him. "Jarn, have you never been sick?" "I once absorbed a hostile fungus that tried to colonize my lower spine. I screamed for 3 days." "Okay, that beats hay fever." There was a long pause. "What is hay?" Jarn asked. Silas sighed. "Dry grass. It makes some of us itchy and sneezy." "You are allergic to grass?" "Sometimes." Jarn dropped from the hammock and landed beside the bed. "I must report this to the biology department." "Please don't." But the next morning, during interspecies medical integration class, the topic had clearly spread. Professor Delna, a short, lavender-skinned instructor with a voice like cracked ice, had changed the lesson plan. Today, she said, we will examine the human immune malfunction known as allergy. Silas slumped in his chair. A holographic projection of his nasal cavity appeared in front of the class, labeled and color-coded. The words histamine reaction floated next to it in large letters. Human Silas, she said, describe your symptoms. Runny nose, sneezing, watery eyes, sometimes a rash. Gadu raised a hand. And you? Survive this? Yeah, Silas muttered. Like I said, it's not fatal. Just miserable. Professor Delna nodded. And the pill you consume? It simply inhibits the histamine. Exactly. She turned to the class. This is considered safe and effective? Safer than sneezing myself unconscious, Silas said. A student in the back, a crystalline entity named Vel, raised his hand. Can we try one of these pills? Silas blinked. Why? To test its effects on non-human biology. No, Professor Delna said immediately. That would be reckless and against regulation. But fascinating, Vel added. Delna ignored him. We will, however, perform a controlled simulation. What followed was a full lab session where students simulated human allergic reactions in artificial tissues using pollen samples from Earth and antihistamines from Silas's emergency kit. The results were displayed on the main screen as graphs and color changes. Gadu stared at the data. So the pill suppresses the immune reaction by blocking the receptors? Basically, Silas said. But your body still thinks there's danger, Krelix added. Yeah, but it stops overreacting. Your species, Professor Delna said, has found a way to silence its own alarm system. Silas rubbed his temples. It's not perfect. Some people still end up in the hospital from bad reactions. Still, the efficiency, Delna mused. Suppressing a natural defense without disabling the organism entirely. We assumed that would require advanced gene manipulation. Nope, Silas said. Just a pill from the corner pharmacy. The next few days, Silas noticed more and more alien students watching him during pollen exposure tests. One group even followed him to the greenhouse lab, where he sneezed 3 times before anyone spoke. You are the resilient one, said a tall, bark-skinned alien named Rill. I'm the allergic one, Silas corrected. It is the same. Silas wiped his nose. Not really. From that point on, his status changed. He was no longer just the human exchange student. He was the guy who could survive invisible plant powder with nothing but a pill and stubbornness. At the next symposium, Professor Delna's presentation was titled Immunological Quirks in Homo sapiens, the Paradox of the Allergy. Silas was the keynote demonstration, much to his dismay. He stood on stage, holding a tissue and a water bottle, while Delna explained how his body had responded to a synthetic pollen mist. He took the pill 10 minutes prior, she said. As you can observe, the reaction is mild. Vel scribbled something into a shimmering notebook. Professor Varn approached afterward. Silas, would you consider participating in an interspecies pharmaceutical trial? Silas shook his head. I'm already the lab rat. I'm good. Still, he couldn't help but smile a little as he walked off stage. Somewhere between the sneezes and the lectures, he'd become something of a curiosity and, somehow, a symbol of strange resilience. Even if it was just because of a tiny white pill. 2 days after the symposium, Silas found himself in the Xenobotany Dome, hunched over an irrigation control panel that had once again short-circuited. The dome was humid, packed with flora from over 20 planets, and the scent of damp bark and mineral-rich soil clung to everything. He was attempting to reroute the nutrient flow to a tray of drooping earth marigolds which, according to the dome records, had been incorrectly labeled as mildly carnivorous atmospheric scrubbers. You're certain these don't consume flesh? Asked Drith, a pale, serpentine alien whose neck coiled like ivy as he peered over Silas's shoulder. They're flowers, Silas said, tapping the screen. They die if you forget to water them for 2 days. That's the opposite of dangerous. Drith's upper eye narrowed. Then why do they emit warning colors? Because that's what we call being cheerful. Behind them, the dome's misting system kicked in with a sharp hiss, releasing a fine cloud of vapor that glistened in the light filtering through the glass ceiling. Silas felt his throat tighten almost instantly. Oh, no. Not again, he muttered, yanking his collar up over his mouth. Drith recoiled slightly. Is this the onset of another bodily revolt? Silas nodded, already rummaging through his jacket pocket. They added new spores to the mist. I need a minute. He dry swallowed another antihistamine, only half listening as Drith began dictating a vocal note about spore-induced mammalian distress events. A few feet away, a cluster of Yalari students had gathered around a sprouting bush that glowed faintly whenever someone exhaled near it. One of them, a tall individual with skin like polished stone, raised a hand and called out, "Human Silas, is your condition contagious?" "No," Silas called back hoarsely, voice already raspy. "Just annoying. Should we sanitize the dome?" "It's not that serious." Drith tilted his head. "You were leaking again." Silas wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his uniform. "Those are tears. It's just part of the reaction. I thought those only occurred during grief or extreme joy. They also happen when my sinuses declare mutiny." Drith looked genuinely disturbed now. "Your face secretes when attacked by air and light?" "Sometimes wind too. And definitely cats." A pause hung between them. "You've survived this long?" Drith asked, incredulous. Silas coughed and nodded. "We adapt." The Allergy students began debating quietly in their own language, their gestures growing increasingly animated. Silas caught the word immunochaotic more than once. Just then, Professor Almec, the dome supervisor, entered through the rear hatch. His forearms were occupied carrying a tray of vacuum-sealed seedlings and a large containment unit labeled Flora, high risk do not handle without barrier gel. "Ah, Martin," Almec said as he approached. "Still functioning, I see." "Barely," Silas replied, voice muffled as he leaned away from a vine releasing shimmering pollen. "We've had several student concerns filed regarding your frequent mucus expulsion," Almec said briskly. "I have reviewed the footage. It is dramatic." "It's allergies," Silas said. "I'm dealing with it." "I was considering whether to recommend a temporary relocation," Almec said, placing the tray down carefully. "But after reviewing the antihistamine data, I'm more intrigued than alarmed." "I can work," Silas said. "Just don't put me near the glowing moss again." Almec raised a brow ridge. "The moss isn't the issue. It's your species' willingness to override internal protocol with chemical suppression. It's disruptively efficient." Silas straightened, inhaling carefully through his mouth. "It's not about efficiency. We just don't have time to be miserable." Drith leaned toward Almec. "He carries the suppressants on his person. Constant access." Almec nodded slowly. "A portable override system." Silas didn't know whether to laugh or be concerned. "You're making it sound more dramatic than it is," he said. "It's not like I'm reprogramming my body. It's just a pill." Almec stepped aside and gestured to the containment unit. "Perhaps you'd be willing to test exposure to this specimen?" Silas looked at the label. "You want me to volunteer myself as a sneeze target?" "It would be controlled. Sealed environment. Monitored by 2 medics." Silas hesitated. "What if it's something my meds can't handle?" "Then we observe." "You've survived worse, yes." He looked between Almec and Drith, then at the curious Yalari still watching him from behind the glowing bush. "I want hazard pay," he said eventually. Almec chuckled. "You're not under contract." "Then I want lunch from the off-world commissary. The one that serves real dairy." Almec extended a lower arm. "Agreed." Later that afternoon, Silas found himself seated inside a transparent enclosure, dressed in a filtration suit with a biometric reader strapped around his wrist. Gadoo had joined the observation team, perched behind a reinforced glass panel with a clipboard and a look of excessive anticipation. "Subject appears healthy," Gadoo noted. "Heart rate elevated, likely due to apprehension. Maybe because you're all staring at me like I'm about to explode," Silas muttered through the comm link. Almec toggled the release valve. "Deploying sample now." A puff of orange spores ejected into the airspace around Silas. For a moment, nothing happened. Then his eyes began to sting. "Oh, here we go," he said, fishing in his pocket for the pill bottle. "Wait, don't ingest yet," Gadoo said. "We need baseline escalation data." "Great," Silas muttered, already tearing up. "You want a tissue analysis too?" "Please deposit one into the sample chute," Gadoo replied. Silas groaned, blew his nose, and dropped the soggy tissue into the receptacle. By minute 16, his nose was fully congested, his breathing shallow, and he'd developed a mild headache. Almec signaled the go-ahead, and Silas took the pill with a sip of water from the internal hydration tube. The effect wasn't instant, but by minute 28, his breathing had steadied. His eyes cleared. The biometric readout began to normalize. "Reaction curve flattened," Gadoo said, clearly impressed. Almec leaned forward. "That's less than 30 minutes. No invasive therapy, no immune recalibration. Drift, standing behind them, hissed softly. It is as if he has command over his own systems. Silas leaned back in the chair, exhausted but stable. I wouldn't go that far. Almec tapped the console. We'll need to debrief. As the chamber depressurized, Silas was escorted out and handed a nutrient bar by a medical assistant who looked part amphibian. He waved them off and sat on a bench in the corridor, munching slowly. Jarn appeared a moment later, carrying a sealed container and a pair of goggles. He dropped the container beside Silas. What's that? Silas asked. Your requested dairy meal. I had to barter a full set of hydrogel filters for it. You're a good roommate. I am documenting this as part of our cultural exchange log, Jarn replied. Also, the Allergies have proposed forming a study group titled Chemical Resilience in Humans, a Practical Guide. Silas snorted. Sounds like a band name. They want you to lead it. Of course they do. Jarn adjusted his goggles and sat beside him. They're fascinated by your willingness to endure discomfort in service of function. That's just life. You don't stop moving because your face itches. Jarn tilted his head. Most species would. Silas unwrapped the meal and took a bite of something that vaguely resembled mac and cheese. It wasn't quite home, but it was close enough. Listen, he said, you all have healing pods and regeneration chambers. We've got over-the-counter pills and a stubborn refusal to rest. Jarn considered this. Both are strategies. Yours is just more improvisational. Silas chewed thoughtfully. That's one word for it. They sat in silence for a moment, the corridor quiet except for the distant hum of ventilation systems and the occasional announcement over the intercom. Then Jarn leaned back and added, you know, if you survive another week, they might name a hallway after you. Silas laughed, then coughed. Let's aim for a statue. By the third week of living on Zeltrax 9, Silas had developed a sixth sense for spotting airborne threats. He could now detect a suspicious shimmer in the air before a spore cloud fully formed, and he'd memorized the dome's mist cycle to the minute. He'd also become adept at holding a conversation while discreetly checking his pulse and swallowing a tablet. It wasn't glamorous, but surviving by sheer vigilance had become a point of personal pride. That morning, he was elbow-deep in a hydroponic basin, trying to untangle a root cluster that had invaded the nutrient line meant for the Earth-origin plants. The vines were from a desert moon called Tal, and apparently had no concept of personal space. They pulsed faintly, warm and slightly sticky, as if resenting being relocated. Careful, said Retna, a small, bat-like creature hovering nearby with a tablet the size of its torso. Those have mild psychotropic defenses. I figured that out when they tried to hug my wrist into submission, Silas muttered, prying a tendril off his glove and tossing it into the isolation bin. You're working faster than last cycle, Retna noted, its wings fluttering in short bursts to stay aloft. Trying to finish before the next missed round, Silas said. Last time I missed the window, I couldn't see straight for an hour. Retna tapped something on the tablet. I input your reaction thresholds into the environmental schedule. The dome should now skip human reactive dispersals during your assigned slots. Silas stopped mid-tangle. You did that. You are one of only 3 mammalian species here. The others wear full filtration suits. You do not. Silas blinked. I thought no one cared. I care about data integrity, Retna said flatly. Your sneeze rate was contaminating the pollen distribution curve. Well, I'm touched. Retna hovered closer. Also, you dropped this in the growth tray yesterday. It handed over a crumpled packet of tissues. Thanks, Silas said, pocketing it. Nearby, a group of student researchers were cataloging the behavioral shifts of a plant that emitted brief musical tones whenever someone walked past. One of the students, a tall creature with branching limbs and iridescent eyes, pointed towards Silas. That one sings louder when he's near it. Retna nodded. It's responding to histamines in his sweat. Silas groaned. Great. I'm a walking jukebox now. You should consider bottling it, the plant student said cheerfully. We could use it to stimulate other species. Not the worst idea I've heard this week, Silas said, stepping back from the basin. Although the shipping label might be awkward. Retna adjusted its flight and circled once. You have become a reliable variable. Your reactions are consistent and measurable. Are you complimenting me or comparing me to a thermometer? Both. Silas peeled off his gloves and leaned against the edge of the basin. You know, back home, everyone just thinks allergies are a nuisance. No one's ever called me reliable for sneezing. Context defines value, Retna said. Here, your dysfunction is statistically useful. Silas chuckled. I'll get that printed on a mug. Later that afternoon, he made his way to the medical annex for his weekly check-in. The nurse on duty was a floating jellyfish-shaped being named Arlo, who enjoyed humming tunelessly while working. The examination room smelled faintly of antiseptic and ozone. Arlo waved a tendril. Vitals first. Silas sat on the bench as sensors attached themselves to his arms and neck. The screen blinked green. Sinus pressure? Manageable. Respiration? Still happening. Arlo rotated one of its eye stalks. You've developed a tolerance curve toward the antihistamines. Silas frowned. Already. Your system is adapting. Dosage effectiveness will reduce unless alternated. I don't have a lot of options. You will now, Arlo said, reaching into a cabinet and producing a small blister pack with pale blue capsules. These are from the Andari stockpile. Similar function, different receptor path. Silas peered at the label. Will it make me nauseous? Possibly. Or euphoric. Side effects vary. Comforting. Arlo pulsed a soft green. We'll monitor. You're the only compatible test subject. No pressure then. As he left the annex, Silas caught sight of a familiar form pacing near the entrance. It was Professor Delna, holding a folded data slate and looking uncharacteristically animated. There you are, she said, striding over. You're needed in the assembly hall. Why? I didn't break anything today. It's not disciplinary. The Interspecies Medicine Council is visiting. They've requested a demonstration. Silas froze. Of what? My sneezing. Of your pharmacological response patterns. I'm not a performer. You're the only one who doesn't require sedation to function under allergenic pressure. Silas sighed. Let me guess. They want to see me react, then recover? Exactly. An hour later, he stood behind a transparent barrier on the stage of the assembly hall. Rows of dignitaries from across the sector sat before him, some elegantly draped in robes, others encased in environmental shells. A single spotlight shone on the space, giving it the feel of a courtroom, or worse, a talent show. Professor Delna stood beside a control panel. Subject is prepared, releasing a microdose of Zeltraxian bloom vapor. Silas braced himself. The vapor hissed into the chamber. Within seconds, his throat itched, his eyes watered, and the first sneeze hit him like a punch. 2 more followed. He waved weakly at the audience. This is the part where you all look at me like I'm about to collapse. There was polite silence. He took the blue capsule, swallowed it dry, and leaned against the chamber wall. Now we wait, he said. 10 minutes passed. The symptoms dulled. The itching faded. His breathing steadied. Professor Delna addressed the council. As you can see, the subject's system stabilizes within a predictable window. No genetic modification, no neural reprogramming. Simple chemical intervention. One of the council members, a crystalline figure with a voice like wind chimes, spoke. And he remains fully conscious during this? Yes, Delna replied. He even volunteers. More murmurs. Silas stepped up to the mic. Look, I know this seems weird to you, but back home, we deal with this stuff daily. We don't have advanced regeneration or immune rewriting. We have pills, syrups, injections if it gets real bad. And we keep showing up. To work, to school, to whatever. The wind chime alien tilted its head. And you do not consider this reckless? It's necessary. We don't get pauses. We adapt. The council conferred briefly, then nodded in unison. Delna tapped a key, and the barrier retracted. You may step down, she said. Afterward, Silas sat outside the hall, drinking from a bottle of electrolytes that tasted vaguely like cucumber and battery acid. Retinol landed beside him. You were coherent throughout, it said. Impressive. I've had practice. The council approved the trial expansion. They want to replicate your response model across cross-species pharmacology. Silas raised an eyebrow. Using human meds? Using your resilience as a baseline. That's a sentence I never expected to hear. Retna tilted its head. You are aware your name is now used as a unit of reaction time? No, I wasn't. 1 Silas equals 28 minutes from exposure to recovery. Silas laughed, then winced. That is both flattering and slightly insulting. It is efficient. He leaned back on the bench, squinting at the sky dome above. You know, I came here thinking I'd just be the guy who sneezed a lot. You are, Retna said. But now you're useful about it. Silas grinned. I'll take it. That night, he returned to his dorm and found a package on his desk. Inside was a sealed jar labeled Experimental Pollen Substitute Non-Allergenic. Beneath it, a note, for when you want to enjoy the flowers without becoming one. He looked up. Jarn was reading on the upper bunk, pretending not to watch. You left this. I requested it from the botany lab. You've earned 1 day without sneezing. Silas opened the jar and inhaled carefully. It smelled like something between vanilla and sunlight. He set it on the windowsill. For once, the air didn't make him flinch.